But anyway, thank you for that introduction. And just to clarify, I am a Venezuelan journalist. I work mostly independently. I used to work for Venezuela Analysis for a few years, uh, and I'm now working or collaborating with other media outlets, primarily with Orinoco Tribune, which I'm sure that you also have heard about. Orinoco Tribune, which is also a Venezuelan English outlet that writes about everything regarding Venezuela and regarding the global south. So I invite you to read that, and I invite you to read my column that I just published there and that I'm going to continue publishing in the following months. And yes, thank you for having me. I know that there's a lot of talk lately about Venezuela regarding the fact that the United States has been issuing these licenses to allow for some temporary operations in the oil industry, mostly production and transactions and sales of oil. Also, so Venezuela can engage again with the international banking system. And I want to clarify that these licenses are just temporary and they allow for limited operations. They do not mean that sanctions against Venezuelans have been lifted. Not at all. I mean, the sanctions are still in place. In fact, just yesterday, acting President Delcy Rodriguez, she was speaking with a U.S. government official that is here in Caracas, and some representative from U.S. companies, and she was clarifying that these licenses do not mean that sanctions have gone away, and she once again demanded that the only way for Venezuela to truly be able to recover its economy, to truly be able to become a productive country and to recover so many social benefits and that were lost during the economic crisis was to completely lift sanctions against the country, to lift all sanctions without any conditions. So I want to clarify that because I know that there's a lot of mainstream media who are using some language saying that the United States is easing sanctions against Venezuela, and that is not the truth. I mean, the truth is that sanctions are still in place, and all of these licenses can be revoked by the U.S. government whenever they want. So sanctions are still there. Um, I was sent some questions before this this happened, and I was asked something very specific that I think is a very important question, uh, saying that usually in economic classes, people are taught that we live in a free market and that all companies, all countries are, they are free to trade with each other as long as they follow the rules. So if that's the case, why can Venezuelan government and the Venezuelan state, the Venezuelan companies simply buy and sell from the businesses of other countries? Like if we live in a free market, then why is Venezuela so blockaded? Why so many impediments? And I was thinking about it, and of course, the first realization is that the whole idea that we have a free market is a lie. We don't have a free market. I mean, the United States and the European allies have always sold the illusion that we live in a global free market and that everybody can do business and have successful trading relations as long as they follow the rules. But that is not true. That is a myth. Because in reality, the way that the market it is engineered right now, it is in order to protect U.S. corporations, to protect the U.S. economic supremacy. And why is that? Well, because the U.S. dollar has been imposed as the global currency for trade, which means that all countries have to trade using the U.S. dollar, especially when you're doing oil and gas transactions. You have to use the U.S. dollar. So you are conditioned to use the United States financial system, the United States dollar, in order to be able to carry out normal transactions, in order to be able to have any kind of bilateral relations with other countries, to do business with any other country or with any other business. So this is why U.S. economic sanctions are so powerful. This is why they have so much teeth. This is why they can actually cause so much damage. Because ultimately the United States has this leverage against the entire planet. they can say, okay, so if you are an enemy state, if we believe that you are not behaving in a way that is uh, compliant with U.S. interests, if we do not believe that you are following what the U.S. Wants from you, if you are promoting an ideological political project that is against capitalism, like Venezuela and Cuba have been doing for many, many years, then we're going to block you from using the international financial system because we have the power to do that, because we control the financial international system, because we control the dollar, so we can block you from all of that. And that is why the US has this exorbitant privilege. They have this coercive power against everybody. And that is what is happening with Venezuela. Specifically, in the case of Venezuela, we have been under US sanctions since 2015. These sanctions have happened in three stages, or two stages, really. The first one began with the Barack Obama government in 2015, with the decree that declared Venezuela an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security of the United States. A lot of people, a lot of mainstream media likes to pretend that this decree didn't mean anything. But in reality, that is when the blockade against Venezuela began. Why? Because the moment this decree was signed by Obama, Venezuela became toxic for business. Like companies, investors, banks across the planet, they began to see Venezuela as a toxic country to do business because they knew that the United States was declaring a Venezuela an enemy state. They knew that what will follow was going to be sanctions. So they stopped investing, they stopped making business with Venezuela. Venezuela became toxic. For example, in 2016, Citibank closed all the accounts of Venezuela's central bank and alleging that Venezuela was too risky to do business with. So from that moment, since 2015, it was when Venezuela began entering this economic crisis period that we experienced for so many years. Um, it became worse in 2017, and this is what I think is the second stage of the U.S. economic terrorism against Venezuela. It became worse in 2017 because the Trump administration declared the maximum pressure campaign. This maximum pressure campaign was basically the complete starvation and asphyxiation of the Venezuelan people. The first sanctions came in August 2017. That is when the U.S. Treasury Department imposed financial sanctions against Venezuela's oil state company, PDVSA, which meant that PDVSA was cut off from the international financial system, which meant that Venezuela could no longer sell oil to other countries. Right after that, in 20 in January 2019, the U.S. declared a complete blockade of Venezuela's oil exports. So any loophole that Venezuela found between 2017 and 2018 to be able to sell oil, when the United States closed all of those loopholes, so we couldn't sell anything because it was completely blockaded. The entire oil industry became completely blockaded. What happened in that moment? The United States ordered all the multinationals foreign companies that were working in Venezuela, that were working in joint ventures with PDVSA in Venezuela, producing oil, extracting oil, and selling oil. They ordered all of these companies to cease all operations and to leave the country, to abandon all of their oil facilities. So they all left. Chevron, Halliburton, all of these companies, they were forced to leave because the U.S. Treasury Department told them so. And this is something that I always like to emphasize because the Trump administration has tried to impose this narrative that all of these foreign companies that were working in Venezuela, in the oil industry in Venezuela, in joint ventures with PDVSA, they tried to make it seem that they were forced to leave because of the Venezuelan government, that they were forced to leave because the political or economic situation in Venezuela didn't allow for them to do business with the Venezuelan state. And that is not the truth. The truth is that it was the U.S. Treasury Department that told them that they needed to leave Venezuela. They needed to abandon all businesses with Venezuela. They needed to abandon all the oil facilities that they had here in Venezuela. The Venezuelan government never decided that. Never decided that. That was not a decision made by the Venezuelan government. So I think it's important always to emphasize that, because I think it's one of the lies that has been incorporated lately by the Trump administration, by mainstream media. So after that, what happened after the United States completely blockaded the oil industry and forced all of the foreign companies to leave the country? Well, the revenues in Venezuela, foreign revenues in Venezuela, reduced drastically, to the point that we were perceiving less than 1% of the revenues that we were perceiving before 2017, before sanctions were imposed. Uh, this meant that Venezuela didn't have any money to be able to import food, medicine, fuel, to support public infrastructure such as electricity, gas, water, public transport, communications, um, to be able to maintain schools, hospitals, to be able to maintain wages and social benefits. So all of that was destroyed because there was absolutely no revenue, or almost no revenue, entering Venezuela. So this is when the Venezuelan government began applying some strategies to try to survive, so the population could survive. One of the first strategies that it applied, it was that it began using gold. They began selling all of the Venezuela's gold reserves to be able to buy food, medicine, fuel, and anything else that the country needed. When the Trump administration realized that Venezuela was now using gold to be able to survive, they also imposed sanctions on Venezuela's gold and mining industries. So we couldn't use our mining industries anymore to be able to survive. So that sector of the economy was also blockaded by the United States. After that, the Venezuelan government apply another strategy. They say, okay, so we can still have some oil production. We cannot sell it to the international market. We cannot commercialize our oil. So we're going to exchange the oil for food, medicine, fuel, and anything else that we need, which meant that they were just, any company, country in the world that wanted Venezuelan oil, they could have it, and they will pay Venezuela with food, with medicine, with anything that we needed at the moment. These exchanges were also cut off by the Trump administration in 2020, in the middle of the COVID pandemic. They were completely cut off by the threat of imposing secondary sanctions on any company or country that dared to do these oil for full exchanges with Venezuela. They were also cut off by threatening to steal any oil tanker that left Venezuela, or any fuel tanker that was coming to Venezuela. And most of you probably remember that Iran tried to send fuel to Venezuela in 2020, and the United States stole those tankers. They stole that fuel that Iran was sending to Venezuela. So that is how the United States has been able to completely destroy the Venezuelan economy, to completely starve Venezuelan population, to asphyxiate Venezuelan economy through sanctions and through coercive power. And right after that, when everything seemed like it was lost, that is when the Venezuelan government realized that, okay, so we need to start applying some unconventional methods. So that's when Venezuela began relying on these intermediaries and these um, companies that are private companies to be able to try to sell some oil. So all of this just to try to survive. Meanwhile, the country entered hyperinflation. We were experiencing severe food, medicine, fuel shortages. Uh, People were just starving. Hospitals were completely destroyed. Millions of people migrated to other countries to try to survive. All of this happened because there was absolutely no other way to survive inside Venezuela. The people who stay here, the people like me who stayed in Venezuela, we literally survived, just by absolute miracle. And that is something that I think is so violent. And the more I think about those years, I realize what an absolutely tremendous psychological impact that has had on every single person in Venezuela. This idea of realizing that every chance, every possibility is blockaded. the feeling that the future of your country has been stolen, this feeling that your entire future has been stolen, especially if you're a young person, especially if you are someone who was very young at the time that happened and you felt like there was absolutely no future and all you could do was try to migrate to another country in a place where you don't know anybody to just to try to survive. So that is basically what I, I know this is like a very short answer to try to explain sanctions, U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, but that is basically what happened. That is how sanctions were applied against Venezuela, and the result was this absolutely devastating humanitarian crisis. Of course, Venezuela has always been such a resilient country, and Venezuela has always had so many good relations with countries like Iran, China, and Russia. So Venezuela found ways to try to sell oil. We found ways to try to reactivate all of these industries. We found ways to produce food, something that we weren't doing before. And I think that's one of the only positive things that I can claim came out from this horrible situation of being under US sanctions. It is that Venezuela achieved a degree of food sovereignty that we didn't have before because we realized that we cannot depend on food imports anymore because that can easily be blockaded by the United States. So now Venezuela has food sovereignty, and now we have a country that is slowly recovering. However, because we were doing that, and because it was obvious that Venezuela was going to be able to survive under US sanctions, and more than survive, we were going to be able to actually continue to carry on the political, ideological project initiated by Hugo Chavez, the socialist project that we initiated in 1998. The United States realized that they needed to do something more drastic. And that is why Venezuela was bombed on January 3rd. That is why they kidnapped President Nicolas Maduro. They needed a drastic action. They needed the power of the US military to be able to subdue Venezuela once more, to be able to apply this coercive power on Venezuela. And the result of that has been that Venezuela is now regrettably under control of the United States in many ways, not politically, but the economy, the oil industry, oil sales in Venezuela are basically under control of the United States, under threat that if we do not comply with that, they're going to bomb Venezuela again, which is something that I think many people forget. That on January 7th, like a few days after the bombings, a few days after kidnapping Maduro, one of the messages that Trump sent to Venezuela was, if you do not comply with what we want, which is that you surrender oil sales to the United States, then we're going to bomb your country again. So we are under this very difficult situation that acting President Delcy Rodriguez is navigating, which is trying to secure peace for Venezuela, which is trying to secure the continuation of the Bolivarian Revolution, also trying to secure the liberation of President Maduro and his wife Silvia Flores, and she's doing all of that under this. What many people describe as having a gun to her head, which I think is a very good analogy, good way to describe it. And that is where we are right now. We are still a country that is under US sanctions. The only difference now is that we have the US is now interested in taking Venezuelan oil under its own conditions, under these licenses that are just temporary and limited, and under the coercion of the Bolivarian leadership. So I think that more or less, I think it is a way to describe how U.S. sanctions have impacted Venezuela and how they continue to impact Venezuela. I don't know if you have any question or if I should just keep going and just go to one of the other questions that you sent me on the chat.
Okay. So if we can hang on just a second, I gotta put my microphone is on. Okay. So let me. Yeah. Okay, so nobody in the audience has a question, but I do actually would request that you define for people what the term secondary sanctions means, because I think some people might not be aware of that term.
Yes, so we have the primary sanctions. Primary sanctions are those that are directly imposed against the country, like the sanctions that are imposed against the Venezuelan oil industry, the sanctions that are imposed against the Venezuela's mining industries, against essential imports, against the banking system, against the Venezuela Central Bank. And just to clarify, these sanctions uh, prohibit U.S. companies, U.S. individuals, and U.S. agents to do business with Venezuela. That is why when they applied the oil blockade, they told all the foreign companies that were in Venezuela, all the U.S. companies here, that they needed to leave. They needed to cease operations and leave because that is what sanctions actually do. They prohibit U.S. companies and U.S. individuals from doing business with Venezuela. Uh, because in reality, you cannot actually place sanctions on a foreign company in itself. They cannot tell PDVSA you cannot do business with this company or these other countries. It is the threat against U.S. companies that they cannot do business with Venezuela. And then you have secondary sanctions, which is basically telling any other foreign company, any other country in the world, if you do business with Venezuela, then we're going to punish you. We're going to take some kind of represalias, how do you say that? Some kind of measures against you. If you do business with Venezuela, we might cut you off from the banking system. We might stop doing trade relations with you. So the secondary sanctions are just a threat against other countries, other companies that if they do business with Venezuela, then they have to sacrifice doing business with the United States, or they have to sacrifice being punished with sanctions against their own companies, so they cannot use the U.S. financial system, so they cannot use, so they don't have access to the U.S. dollar. So that's basically how they make this change of extraterritorial measures that can affect, that can completely blockade a country. Um, and there's also this phenomenon that is called overcompliance. And I don't know if you read this report, but the Elena Duhan, who is a United Nations independent expert, she came to Venezuela a few years ago, and she did a report just explaining what U.S. sanctions were doing against Venezuela, and she explains in that report that one of the most uh, difficult aspect of U.S. sanctions is that a lot of countries don't have to be threatened. They don't have to be threatened with secondary sanctions. They don't have to be threatened with anything. They simply do not do business with Venezuela because they know that the moment they try to engage with Caracas at all, are going to be targeted by the United States. So it creates this phenomenon of overcompliance, of many countries, many companies in the world that they refuse to do business with Venezuela just under the precaution that they want to be safe. They want to make sure that the United States doesn't turn their economic and military power against them. So there's all of these ways to apply all of these terrorism that I always insist that anything that the United States does to other countries has to be called terrorism, whether that is economic terrorism, whether that is military terrorism, but it is terrorism at the end of the day. So yeah, I hope that sort of answered your question. I do recommend that you read the book that you were speaking about at the beginning, a book that we published in Venezuela Analysis a few years ago. It has a much better detailed explanation about every kind of sanctions, primary, secondary, over compliance, how they affect specifically every sector of the Venezuelan economy. So if you want to really learn about that, I recommend reading that book. I also recommend reading the report by Elena Duhan. I actually wrote a sort of like uh, I wrote an article just taking the most important parts of Elena Duhan's report. Uh, it was published by Progressive International and it was translated to several languages. So you can also read that if you want to understand specifically how much Venezuela's population was affected by U.S. sanctions.
Thank you. Are there any other questions at this time? Any other questions? Okay. All right. So please go ahead with some of the other questions we forwarded to you ahead of time, please.
Okay. So another question that you sent me was, we're also told that some of our sanctions are against individuals for their participation in human rights violations or other activities that the US calls criminal. So how do sanctions against individuals impact Venezuelans more broadly? Yeah. So again, I think it's important to clarify that Venezuela is primarily targeted by broad sanctions, by primary sanctions, by sanctions against the entire economy, sanctions against the oil industry, against the mining industry, and against everything that is necessary for a country to function. And I say it because I also have realized that oftentimes mainstream media tries to downplay these sanctions against Venezuela's economy, and they emphasize the individual sanctions, which are sanctions that are applied against Venezuelan government officials, as the only sanctions that really matter. And they do that because they are trying to imply that all the United States is doing with the sanctions regime is just try to punish some corrupt individuals or human rights abusers. So I think it's always important that every time that we think about sanctions against Venezuela, we always put the focus on the fact that Venezuela is being completely asphyxiated by the U.S. Treasury Department, by Washington, in every aspect. And the individual sanctions, although they are also impactful, they are not the main concern for the majority of the Venezuelan people. I think it's also good to clarify that it is true that most of these individual sanctions are based on accusations that these people who are government officials or military officials have been involved in corruption cases or have been involved in human rights abuses. And most of these accusations come from gross exaggerations or misinterpretation of certain political moments that happen in Venezuela. For example, we have some very violent protests in 2014, 2017, 2019, and 2024. These protests were not spontaneous. They didn't just happen because the people decided that they needed to protest something. Protests in Venezuela happens all the time. Both Chavista and opposition sectors have always been very vocal and have always taken to the streets whenever they want to denounce or protest anything. But these protests were not like that. They didn't have that popular characteristic. These were protests that were very strategic. They were directed, they were financed by the far-right sectors in Venezuela, specifically the sectors linked to Maria Corina Machado, which is like the most far-right political figure that we have in Venezuela. With the specific aim, these protests were financed and directed with the very specific aim of creating the conditions to overthrow the Venezuelan government, of creating the conditions to try to force a foreign intervention in Venezuela and try to force a regime change. For example, we also had an incident in the border between Colombia and Venezuela in 2019, in which these far-right sectors, they tried to create the illusion that they were going to bring humanitarian aid to Venezuela without the consent of the Venezuelan government. And in reality, this was a way to try to open the gates for a military intervention in Venezuela. And all of these trucks that they were trying to push through the border from Colombia to Venezuela didn't have any food or any kind of humanitarian aid. They were filled with weapons, or a lot of them were empty. So that's how you realize that all of these moments the mainstream media has portrayed as these spontaneous popular protests, and that the Venezuelan government repressed is actually not like that. These were strategic things that happened because certain sectors in Venezuela were looking to overthrow the government. And they were a lot of violence that was directed against the Chavista people, against the Venezuelan people, in order to create the conditions for confrontation. And I say this with absolute, with absolute certainty because I lived through every single one of these violent protests, and I went through every single, like I experienced every single kind of violence that they were enacted, especially because I am a brown, very indigenous looking woman. So every time I would pass any of these protests, I was immediately recognized as a possible Chavista person. So I I was, I don't want to say the victim, but just the victim of a lot of violence that against me. And I saw this happen all across Caracas, and I saw this happen all across other cities of Venezuela. So we, people who lived through all of that, we know exactly what happened. We know who were the people who were violent, and we know that they were aiming to attack to Chavista people, aiming to attack people just because of the color of their skin, and they were aiming to just turn the country into chaos. So a lot of people that participated in those violent uprisings, they were arrested. They faced some punishment. They were, yeah, they were arrested, and a lot of that are actually being released because the Venezuelan government just issued an amnesty to release a lot of the people that were involved in these violent situations, which we celebrated because something that has being very at the core of the Bolivarian revolution, it is that we always need to find ways to promote reconciliation and dialogue. And Hugo Chavez used to believe in that as well. Right after the coup against Hugo Chavez in 2002, like very soon after that, he also forgave every person that participated in that coup, and he issued an amnesty to release all the prisoners, even though these people staged a coup against the Venezuelan government. So yeah, I just wanted to clarify that because the narrative of human rights abuses in Venezuela has been so distorted and has been used as a weapon to try to justify all of the aggression that Venezuela has been living under the United States. Um, that said, I do want to clarify that individual sanctions do have an impact. They do have a collateral impact on the Venezuelan economy. Um, why? Because these people, of all of these government officials that are under U.S. sanctions, it means that they cannot engage in global financial transactions. They cannot travel. They cannot facilitate foreign investment. Uh, they cannot carry out financial transactions on behalf of the Venezuelan state. They cannot do business with other countries on behalf of the Venezuelan state. So it is, of course, it is problematic for a government official of any country to have all of these limitations because they are representative of Venezuela, of the Venezuelan state. So they need to have the freedom to be able to engage with the rest of the international community, to be able to travel freely, to be able to engage in negotiations, in business transactions, and they cannot do that freely because they are designated under this list of the United States makes to designate politicians as being banned from all of these operations. So also individual sanctions are also illegal under international law. The United States doesn't have the jurisdiction to be able to impose individual sanctions against government officials from other countries. But again, these individual sanctions, they do not cause the same economic damage as primary sanctions, as sanctions against the oil industry can do. So that is why usually we don't really speak too much about individual sanctions because uh, at the end of the day, we believe that once you lift all the economic sanctions, you also have to lift the individual ones. Like that is going to happen. Um, I'm aware that the United States very recently also lifted some of the individual sanctions against acting President Delcy Rodriguez, and that is of course also something that It is entirely in the benefit of the United States. They need to do business with Delcy Rodriguez, and they're just tasting the waters. They're trying to they're trying to make it seem like they have good relations with President Delcy Rodriguez, because the narrative that she somehow betrayed Maduro or that she is the puppet of the United States has little by little being fallen down. I mean, people have come to realize that Delcy Rodriguez didn't actually betray Maduro. She has been saying repeatedly, publicly, every chance that she gets, that there was absolutely no treason, that the country was under attack, that President Maduro knew that he was going to be kidnapped, the that the leadership that it is in place now in Venezuela, it is a leadership that is loyal to President Maduro. It is a leadership that knows that they need to secure President Maduro's liberation. They continue to recognize Maduro as the constitutional president of Venezuela, and they continue to recognize the Bolivarian project, and specifically the communal project that Hugo Chavez began and that Maduro continued to promote. Um, so yes, individual sanctions are also illegal. They're also dangerous. They shouldn't exist. Uh, and I think they should be lifted as well as any other sanction against Venezuela.
We have a question from the audience. Okay, the microphone's on. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So it feels to be like this is a very similar thing that the U.S. has done over decades with numerous countries, especially ones that move towards a socialist government. And so it's just interesting to hear a similar story that we've seen where we go somewhere and instigate these violent quote unquote protests and use that as a reason to come in. But ultimately it feels like the main goal is to subjugate, to extract resources, to colonize it, just as we've done in America for years. So, my question would really just be, being that we're in the belly of the beast here, and we can call our representatives, and we can try to work with organizations that are supporting your country. What would you say would be the most impactful things that we can do within the next few months from inside of America?
Thank you for that question. I think it's so important that as people who are living inside the United States and are U.S. citizens, that you make that question, that you think about that. Uh, I've often said that one of the main things, one of the most important things that anybody can do, people like me, people like you, who are in this field of journalism and activism and all of this, one of the main things that we can do is always try to overthrow the narrative against Venezuela, whether that is the narrative about human rights abuses, the narrative about socialism being the cause of Venezuela's economic crisis, ignoring completely the fact that Venezuela was fine before U.S. sanctions, and that it was because of U.S. sanctions that we entered this economic crisis, and it was because of U.S. sanctions why millions of Venezuelans were forced to leave the country, many of them actually going to the United States. So I think it's important that we always find ways to make sure that the general population in the United States gets to know this, gets to know what is actually happening, what actually happened in Venezuela, that they know what U.S. sanctions actually mean, what is the real impact that they have on populations, that they know how the Bolivarian Revolution was actually a project that was simply about dignity, it was simply about improving people's life, it was simply about recovering sovereignty, it was about standing up for justice, it was about regional integration, it was about global South unity. It was about imagining a future in a world in which people weren't subjugated to one superpower, to one economic military superpower like the United States. So I always think that the best way to try to fight all of this, it is always a narrative. And actually, when the genocide in Gaza began a few years ago, and we were all watching these horrible images on social media, and people began more and more aware of what Israel actually was and what it was doing to the Palestinian people, I think that is something that confirmed to me that indeed the narrative is so important. Because before the Gaza genocide began, there were still the majority of the planet, the majority of the people, especially the people in the United States, had no idea what actually was happening in Palestine. They had no idea that Israel was a genocidal apartheid state. And I think that the way that people began just questioning everything that Israel was doing, they began, promoting all of, talking about what was happening in Palestine. Changing the narrative has been so important because it maybe it didn't end the genocide, but it definitely changed people's mind. It definitely made people see things more clearly. It made them realize that Israel and the United States are the enemies. It made people realize that the United States is simply using Israel as a colony in the Middle East to be able to impose its colonial project in Western Asia. I mean, I think that was so important. So I do believe that always trying to find out the reality about Venezuela and exposing all of that is so important. But more than that, and I want to be completely honest with you, since the bombings happened in January, since Caracas was attacked in January and President Maduro was kidnapped, and the absolute traumatic experience that was for the Venezuelan people who were here and had to live through all of that, uh, I've come to the realization that I really believe that at this point, the United States citizens like you, people who live in the United States, it is time to focus your energy in trying to change your political system. I think the United States needs to have a people's revolution. I think that is the only way that we are actually going to be able to save this planet, to save this Venezuela, to save the majority of the people in the world who are suffering because of U.S. actions. I don't think the Trump administration it is an anomaly. I think he is just an extreme expression of what U.S. imperialism has always been, whether that is under George Bush or Barack Obama or President Biden. I think it's just like a more extreme expression of all of the fascist actions that the United States has always carried out against countries in the periphery, countries in the global south. I do believe that at this point I will encourage the US people to please, you need to start thinking about uh, rising up against this corporate political elite that is not only killing people in Palestine, Iran, Venezuela, and Cuba, but also killing people inside the United States, doing all of these horrible things against migrants, doing all of these horrible things against normal citizens that are protesting U.S. injustices. So I think that will be my main advice. Just really start organizing more. You need to begin a revolution inside the United States.
Thank you so much. That was awesome.
Are there other questions, please, for them? Anibal, yes.
Do you think that the being a military regime still Hugo Chavez missed the opportunity to incorporate more military strategy in order to contrast the power of the United States? Of course, Iran has been for years building because they knew it's going to come anyway, the attack from. And you even mentioned that Maduro was guessing or thinking that he might be kidnapped. So, do you think Hugo Chavez and the military strategies in your country miss the opportunity to build a strong military force for this time? I guess the question is preposterous, but do you think it could have helped a little bit?
Yeah, I know. I mean, I understand where the question comes from. Like, I understand why you will have that idea. I think it is because we are completely different societies. Venezuela didn't think about its military since the Bolivarian Revolution, since Hugo Chavez came to power. Venezuela didn't imagine its military as a force to cause damage, as a force to invade, or as a force to prevent a military intervention. The Venezuelan military was built under uh, the Bolivarian ideas, which is to promote integration, which is to promote social justice, which is to promote the unity between civilians and military. So, for example, the Venezuelan military grew a lot under Hugo Chavez because Hugo Chavez dignified the military. They used to be, I mean, the military didn't really have good conditions of living, good living conditions. Hugo Chavez dignified the military, and so it grew under Hugo Chavez, but it was used as a way to help the population. It was used as a way to, for example, all the social missions that Chavez created, the healthcare mission, the education mission, it was carried out mostly by the military. They were the ones who helped build all of the infrastructure. They was the one who helped uh, take all of these voluntary people to all of these remote places in Venezuela. They were the ones who helped with this identification campaign in which people were able to, for the first time, have identification papers. So the military was never imagined in a way that the United States probably has. It was always like a social component of society. It was meant to help the Venezuelan people. It was meant to, it was, of course, it has a defensive strategy, but it's not a defensive strategy that is imagined in such a violent scenario as an invasion. So I think that is mostly why we couldn't uh, confront the U.S. military. I think in the months leading to President Maduro's kidnapping, when the United States was blockading the Caribbean Sea and the Pacific Ocean, and they were bombing these small boats with civilians in the Caribbean. They killed like 150 people or more. During those months, of course, Venezuela was in high alert, and the military tried to create some defensive strategies to try to protect Venezuela for an invasion. And in many ways, they did a good job, but I don't think Venezuela was ever going to be able uh, to be a match for the power that is the U.S. military, because the U.S. military was built precisely for invasion, for aggression, for it was built with the idea of controlling other populations, of exerting violence over other populations. So in that scenario, the U.S. is really an expert. I think Iran is very different from Venezuela in many ways. Iran, I mean, not only has been around for millennia, but they also have been preparing for a U.S. invasion for many decades. So they have many decades to anticipate what the United States is doing now, especially because they are also in close proximity to Israel, which has always been a threat to countries like Iran. So it's very different geopolitical situations. I think perhaps from now on the Venezuelan military might go through some transformations. Um, but yeah, I think I guess I don't have a direct answer to that. That is what I can say.
That's a good answer.
Are there any more questions from the floor? There was, I think, another question that we had submitted in writing to you. Can you?
Yeah. Yes, you want me to go to that? So
Please.
the other question that you sent me, it was about Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. That why don't these organizations consider sanctions to be human rights violations? And I was thinking about that a lot when I read the question, and I realized that, well, I think it's very the main answer that I can give to that is that neither Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International is a promoter or defender of human rights. These are organizations that are centered on promoting Western views, promoting Western ideology, promoting Western policies, promoting Western interests, Western capitalism. And they do that by targeting and misrepresenting other nations that the United States considers to be threats or considers to be enemies, like Cuba and Venezuela. And you have to look at who are these organizations. I mean, Human Rights Watch is a private NGO. It is based in New York. So it is a biased organization. It is also an organization that, if you look at the funding, who is funding Human Rights Watch? I know that they handle a budget of millions and millions of dollars. And we also know that most of the donors and contributors are not publicly listed, that they are not you cannot really know who exactly are donated to Human Rights Watch. And you can imagine that a lot of the funding must come from some government-related agencies. And why? Because if you look at who Human Rights Watch is often with, like whenever you see human rights representative, they're always alongside U.S. politicians or U.S. corporations that they tell you on whose side they are. And we do know about some of the donors that they have. I mean, in some cases, it has been made public. And for example, the Open Society by George Soros has been one of the main contributors to Human Rights Watch. And if we just take a look at what Open Society is or who George Soros is, we know that this is an organization that has been funding NGOs across the planet to be able to promote regime change agendas in countries that are that oppose the United States. For example, in Venezuela, Human Rights Watch, it is sort of like the parent NGO to many NGOs here in Venezuela, but specifically Provea. And Provea has been one of the main organizations that has created this narrative that Venezuela it is a human rights violations country, that we don't have any kind of security here, that nobody is free, nobody is able to protest, nobody is able to speak up against the government. So, and a lot of the funding of Provea, of this Venezuelan NGO, comes from Human Rights Watch. So yeah, if you look at who these organizations are, where they are based, who the funding comes from, you realize that they are not actual NGOs. They're just an extension of the U.S. government. And it is almost the same with Amnesty International. So Amnesty, from what I understand, it is based in the UK. I think it has. I think I've never seen Amnesty International actually do anything to promote, do anything to question any actions of the United States or any actions of Europe in general. Actually, if you see the statements that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International published right after the bombing that happened in January, you can completely tell that they do not actually care about questioning any of the actions of the United States. In these statements, in the case of Human Rights Watch, the main thing that they said is that they regretted that the United States kidnapped President Maduro and didn't end the entire Venezuelan government. Like, they regretted that the rest of the Venezuelan government was still in place. And they were like, okay, so you kidnapped Maduro, but now Delcy Rodriguez is the president. The entire leadership continues to be there. So this means that human rights violations will continue. So they didn't care about the fact that the U.S. bombed Venezuela, killed 100 people. They didn't care that the United States violated international law, that they violated the principles of sovereignty and self-determination, that they violated the UN Charter. They didn't care about any of that. They only care about the fact that they only took Maduro and that they didn't eliminate the rest of the Venezuelan government. The same thing happened with Amnesty International. Amnesty International issued a statement a few days after the bombings, in which they said that, okay, so yes, the United States violated international law, but what are we going to do with the rest of the Venezuelan government? It's not enough that you only took Maduro out. So this is the political agenda that they have. They have this agenda, this political agenda that is in favor of the United States, that is in favor of U.S. economic and political interests. So they are never going to acknowledge U.S. sanctions of human rights violations, especially because these organizations were the ones who actually lobbied Washington to push for these sanctions to happen. Human Rights Watch was the one who primarily promoted the narrative that the Venezuelan government was committing human rights abuses and that they needed to be sanctioned some way, that they needed to be stopped some way. So these organizations actually created the justification for U.S. sanctions to happen. So I think the short answer would be that neither Human Rights Watch or Amnesty International are actually about human rights. They have a political agenda that it is above anything that has to do with human rights. And that is not to say that maybe in some cases or in some point in history these organizations have actually denounced real human rights abuses, but it's not the main concern. It's not the thing that they care about the most. They're always going to prioritize the political agenda. And I think one example of that it is the fact that even though at some point they have published something about Israel and said that Israel is an apartheid state and it has committed abuses against the Palestinian people, at the same time they never call for any kind of international action against Israel. They never say that Israel needs to be sanctioned or blockaded or thrown out of the financial international system. They never said that. They only say that about Venezuela and Cuba and any other country that is an enemy of the United States. So yeah, I think that is the best way to answer that question is that we need to start believing that these organizations have any kind of moral authority. They don't. They don't. And we need the same thing with the International Court of Justice, like all of these organizations that have been propped up as some kind of freedom organization, justice organizations. They're not. These organizations that are committed to they are committed to persecuting any African or Latin American leader, any African or Latin American government, but they are never going to do anything against the United States or the allies of the United States. And we need to start accepting that. Stop expecting a coherent speech from these organizations.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ron.
Hi. What is the state of left-wing solidarity in South America right now? Like in regards to like left-leaning states like Brazil and Colombia, are they helping the Venezuelan people as they go through this crisis? Or is everybody realized kind of and threatened with tariffs, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, lefty solidarity in Latin America has suffered a lot in the past few years. Not only since the kidnapping of President Maduro, it has suffered a lot in the past few years. I think it has diminished a lot, unfortunately. A lot of that has to do with the fact that being friends with Venezuela, having normal bilateral relations with Venezuela has become some sort of death sentence for any leftist government in Latin America. If you are in any way associated with Venezuela, it means that you might lose voters, you might lose the support of the people, because Venezuela has been portrayed as a country that is a failed state, that is a repressive country, that is a country that is trying to impose some kind of a socialist failed policy. And also because of the threat of the United States. Being friends with Venezuela is also putting yourself directly in the line of aggression from the United States. And we saw that with Gustavo Petro, with the president of Colombia. When the United States was bombing civilians in the Caribbean and the Pacific Ocean last year, we saw Petro publicly denounce the fact that the United States was committing extrajudicial killings, the fact that they didn't have any proof that the people they were bombing were narco traffickers. And he was saying that this is just like an excuse to be able to attack Venezuela. He suffered from that. I mean, we saw how the U.S. government, the Trump administration, began threatening Gustavo Petro that he will be next. That all the efforts of all the regime change efforts against Venezuela will now going to be replicated against Colombia. So I think that is something um, that has happened in the past few years, in which we have seen leftist governments that willingly have established distance with Venezuela because they know that associating with Venezuela can be harmful for them because of all the lies told about Venezuela, because of the demonization of Venezuela, and at the same time because they are trying to stay away from the threat that the United States is. Actually, right after the Trump administration bombed Venezuela in January, we saw him how he immediately began threatening every other country in Latin America that dare to say something, that dare to defend Venezuela, that dare to try to oppose what the United States was doing. And that is something that we were warning for so many years. I mean, Venezuela has been warning that if we don't stand up for Venezuela, if we don't stand up for Cuba, for Nicaragua, for any other country that has been under U.S. aggression, it means that eventually the United States is going to do this to everybody else. And unfortunately, we were right about that. So I think, yeah, that is the state of relationships of the left in Venezuela right now is not the best, and it is so far away from what it was in the early 2000s when Hugo Chavez and Lula da Silva and so many other leftist presidents were in charge.
Do you have time for any other questions? I know we've been very grateful for your time so far. Is there any other questions from
where we going now? Venezuela.
What you say?
In this situation, what is the positive thought that you can have?
Were you able to hear Anibald's question?
And I didn't really understand the question.
In English, here people say, where do we go now, or something?
Where do we go from here? I guess, is that right?
¿A dónde vamos? ¿Cuál puede ser el cambio positivo que pueda esperar el pueblo de Venezuela?
So I think where to go now, it is a very difficult question to answer. There's a lot of uncertainty regarding Venezuela. We know that the Trump administration has said that they're going to control Venezuela's oil industry indefinitely, and we know that they said that any defiance against that is going to be met with military force. We also know that they continue to impose sanctions against Venezuela, and that they're only issuing these licenses, these temporary limited licenses, and that they can revoke those licenses whenever they want, and they can reinforce sanctions against Venezuela, and they can actually make it worse. We know that they are capable of a naval blockade against Venezuela, which we already experienced. During that naval blockade, we came to the realization that the United States is very willing to steal oil tankers that leave Venezuela or anything that enters Venezuela. So it's very uncertain to say where we go now. I think what the Delcy Rodriguez government is doing, it is the only way, it is the only path forward. Delcy Rodriguez has said that they're going to respond to the U.S. aggression through diplomacy, through dialogue, through basically to try to normalize relations in a way. And I know for a lot of people that seems very controversial, but I think the main the main priority for Venezuela right now. It is to secure peace for people. It is to secure some conditions of economic well-being for the population. It is to be able to secure the basis of the Bolivarian project, which is the popular communes across Venezuela and these socialist self-organizing uh, organizations that began under Hugo Chavez can continue. We know that the future is not going to be capitalism. We know that this is a dying system. We know that the future is going to be a community, is going to be a socialist society. And right now, the best we can do is try to navigate this complicated moment and try to stay afloat and try to protect the Venezuelan people, and in order to try to make sure that we live to see the revolution for another day. So we live to continue the revolution. It doesn't make any sense right now to just self-immolate, to do something that will just simply mean that everything that we have built for 25 years, it is finished, it is somehow demolished by the power of U.S. military. The best thing we can do right now is to make sure that we can continue that project. Uh, because at the end of the day, U.S. imperialism is also a dying empire. And we have seen that in the past few years. Um, I also believe that in many ways, the trial against President Nicolas Maduro is going to have a very strong effect, a very strong impact on the U.S. people, on the international community as a whole, because there is, of course, all of the charges against Maduro are so completely false. They don't have any kind of basis. They have no way of actually proving anything. And I think that's going to unmask the U.S. government. I think that's going to make people actually realize how much they are willing to lie, to demonize a government and a president in order to impose economic interests. So I think right now for Venezuela, the only path forward what we're doing right now, like President Delcy Rodriguez is doing right now, which is trying to fight against this criminal power with through the realm of diplomacy, but always maintaining dignity, always maintaining sovereignty, always trying to defend the right of the Venezuelan people to choose their own destiny.
Thank you very much. All right, so we got the room for just a few, 20 more minutes, and we're gonna have some announcements. But I'd like for me to make sure the camera's on, and I would request that our attendees give Andreína a nice thank you and applause.
Yeah.
Can you thank you very much. Thank you so much for taking your time to educate us.
No, thank you. Really, I mean, I appreciate being able to just give any kind of knowledge that I can have or any kind of lived experience that I have, just because I'm Venezuelan and I live here, and I have been able to experience this entire Bolivarian revolution since its conception. And just so you know, I mean, I'm not an expert. I just happen to be someone who entered this field of journalism, and someone who, from the very first moment, realized that the only way to do real journalism was to be an anti-imperialist journalist, and also someone who, for some reason, at some point in my life, decided to learn English to try to communicate with people who outside Venezuela, who I know are the main victims of all of these false narratives about my country.